Black Sabbath's guitarist lost his fingers in an industrial accident. Heavy metal band Black Sabbath's guitarist Tony Iommi worked in a factory before he began his musical career. Accustomed to operating one specific machine at work, Tony was switched to a different role and, due to a mechanical accident, lost the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand. The guitar god considered relearning his craft on a restrung instrument, as he was naturally left-handed, but his future lay on a different path. He fashioned caps for his shortened fingers from melted plastic bottles in order to hold down the strings. Additionally, he changed the tuning on his guitar, making for what could be called a heavier sound. Those strange tunings became key to the type of music that he would make in Black Sabbath, and served as the foundation for what would become the heavy metal genre. Alexander Fleming forgot to clean his lab. He is credited with discovering penicillin in 1928, and his methodology stemmed from forgetting to do the dishes. He spent the month of August on holiday with his family. Upon his return, he noticed that one of his petri dishes had grown a mould that wiped out the sample around it. He then grew the mould in a pure culture and discovered it could annihilate gram-positive pathogens. Penicillin didn't catch on for several years, but once it did, it was widely used to treat allies in World War II, saving countless lives. The Mars Climate Orbiter can't convert its units. In 1999, the Mars Climate Orbiter was programmed to perform a number of tasks to measure Mars's atmosphere and climate. It was also going to be the communications relay for the polar landing. NASA aimed to gather never-before collected data on the red planet. However, when the orbiter was launched, it disintegrated in the very atmosphere it was sent to analyse. Aerospace company Lockheed Martin produced ground software that ran calculations in pound-seconds rather than Newton-seconds. This error resulted in unusable thrusters, and the craft was ultimately lost. Japan picked the wrong targets. Japan's attack on December 7th, 1941 concentrated most of its fire on American battleships, a strategy the Japanese believed would hamper US power at sea. As such, Japan's plans didn't concentrate on the base's fuel reserves, repair yards, or incredibly, the aircraft carriers present. Thus, when the smoke cleared, the US kicked their repair yard into full gear and were able to return ships to sea quickly. As the conflict progressed, US naval dominance eventually came from submarines and aircraft carriers. The Battle of New Orleans was fought too late. In the Battle of New Orleans, the American and British forces hadn't yet received word that the countries had signed the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending hostilities. As a result, bloody Andrew Jackson led his men in a rout of the British forces. In the fight on January 8th, the British lost 2,000 men compared to America's 7. Although the fight wasn't strictly necessary in terms of winning the War of 1812, The victory created a wave of popularity that eventually took Jackson to the White House. D-Day paratroopers scattered all over the beaches. One crucial component of the D-Day invasion was the dropping of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions prior to the amphibious strike on the beaches of France. As the drops began, however, bad weather, anti-aircraft fire and other factors led to the wide dispersal of Allied paratroopers. The dispersal sufficiently confused the German command structure. Forces seemed to be everywhere, striking a variety of targets and operating with seemingly no centralised base or command structure. One reason for this was that the teams were formed based on improvisation. Soldiers adapted to conditions wherever they landed. The Germans were unsure if this was the full invasion, a partial one, or an extremely elaborate prank. Further, much of the German command was scattered itself. Many were training off-site. While the scattering of forces complicated matters, it did enable the element of surprise and build upon other deception tactics to keep the German forces in disarray. Columbus missed Asia. Despite the popular misconception that Columbus discovered America, the explorer really wanted to find a route to Asia by going west from Europe, a concept that was widely considered to be fairly unrealistic even at that time. Ultimately, Columbus collided with the Bahamas, Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Central and South America. While he never found his route to Asia, despite his own claims to the contrary, Columbus did initiate the bigger boom of European exploration and more or less guaranteed permanent contract between the two hemispheres. Fox turned over Star Wars rights to George Lucas. After making American Graffiti, George Lucas had a first-look deal in place with Universal, who ultimately passed on Star Wars. As part of the deal that Lucas eventually made with Fox, he retained both sequel and merchandising rights. To 1977 studio executives, the arrangement seemed perfectly reasonable, as sequels were not yet a cultured phenomenon, nor were franchises. Even Fox's executives were rather skeptical about the space opera's financial prospects. When Star Wars dropped, however, box offices were shaken to their core, and Lucas was able to make his sequels the way he chose, all while making yet another fortune on merchandise. Static build-up caused the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg disaster is one of history's most baffling mysteries. Many are unsure of what exactly went wrong. Some still suspect sabotage, but the generally accepted notion is that the static build-up and discharge is what ignited the hydrogen in the LZ-129 Hindenburg on May 6th, 1937. Others say docking mistakes were also at fault. While the true cause is unknown, the subsequent explosion and loss of 36 lives more or less marked the end of the airship era. General Pickett charged directly into enemy hands. General Robert E. Lee ordered a charge directly up the middle at General George G. Meade's position, but it was an order that Meade had anticipated the previous night. After artillery fire on the Union position, about 15,000 Confederate soldiers, 75 miles of open field, they made for Meade's fixed position, taking heavy volumes of artillery fire. When some reached the target wall, they were repelled by the cost of 6,000 lives. Many experts point to the charge and the subsequent loss at Gettysburg as the turning point of the conflict, and the Confederacy would go on to surrender in April 1865. Titanic's lookout had no binoculars. Many of the reasons behind the tragedy of the Titanic are already well known. Few life rafts were available. Class separation increased the number of casualties, and the ship's boisterous claim of unsinkability most likely led to the general ill-preparedness. A lesser-known oversight, however, is that the ship's lookout had no binoculars. The ship was sailing relatively fast given the icy conditions, despite warnings from other vessels. The event also occurred at night, when the extreme darkness would have resulted in limited visibility. However, because of this, the potential utility of binoculars is debated, but whether or not such a tool could have saved the ship will remain unknown. The fallout of the disaster greatly improved ocean-going safety, as it introduced many regulations regarding available life crafts and the manning of radios, and created the International Ice Patrol. The military invading Russia during the winter. In 1708, Sweden invaded Russia during a fierce winter. The invaders were thousands of men in that particular push. 100 years later, Napoleon also attempted an occupation that began in summer. By late autumn, he'd lost thousands of soldiers, and though he succeeded in occupying Moscow, he eventually had to retreat. The most famous example, however, occurred during World War II. Hitler believed he could take Russia before winter, but his army wasn't ready when winter finally did come. In fact, things went so poorly that the Germans lost approximately 750,000 men before November.
And this concludes the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please click the like button, give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe for future videos. Thank you.